Welcome to the GCSE Power and Conflict Anthology Annotation for Remains by Simon Armitage. So in terms of first annotations, we're going to look at context and structure. So anything to do with context is in green and anything to do with structure is in purple. So in terms of structure, this has no regular rhyme or rhythm, which could reflect the narrative and unpredictable or disordered thoughts from the speaker. So because this person is having to deal with trauma and process the trauma, that means that his thoughts are quite disordered, which is why there's no regular rhythm or rhyme. There's a use of first person plural, like exposure, in the first part of the poem, which suggests a collective experience. As we go through, you'll see that that collective experience changes to a more personal experience. In terms of context, it was written in 2008, and it is an exploration of the impact of war on soldiers. It's important to note that Armitage did not fight in any wars, but he did extensively interview lots of people who had experienced war. It's based on the account of a British soldier who served in Iraq, and it charts the issue of PTSD amongst soldiers, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So moving on to the first stanza, it starts with on another occasion. The use of on another occasion firstly gives the impression that this is an anecdote being told by somebody, so it conforms to the idea of it being a dramatic monologue. It also gives the impression that this is not an isolated incident because of the use of another. This could reflect the extent of the trauma that the speaker has experienced. When he talks about legging it up the road, this is a use of colloquial language, which again adds to the idea of it being an anecdote and writing as a character in terms of Armitage reflecting the soldier that he is writing about. The colloquial language also reinforces the idea that this is an anecdote. The adverbs probably and possibly are tentative, which reflect the decisions and repercussions of these decisions. So the use of probably and possibly actually makes the reader consider whether the thing that happened or the event that followed was justified, I suppose you could say. This is the use of collective noun that I spoke about in the previous slide. So the repetition of all demonstrates a collective responsibility. So at this point, the speaker is unwilling to accept personal responsibility. He argues that everybody who was there is equally responsible for what happened. The juxtaposing image here of opening fire. So we're talking about somebody raiding a bank. We're not really sure whether they're armed or not. And then all of a sudden we learn that the soldiers open fire. And this is quite a surprising statement, which could reflect the idea that this was an unnecessary act of violence or an inappropriate use of violence. And then at the end, we've got a change to a personal pronoun of I, which changes to an individual experience. The repetition of I see on both of these lines demonstrates the impact of the scene, and the memory of this is really visceral for the narrator, for the speaker. The violent metaphor of ripping through his life has two meanings. So firstly, it demonstrates the vulnerability of the fragility of his life, but also the idea that you can destroy someone and everything that goes with that, so their memories, their hopes, their dreams, in a split second. The use of life and he and his tends to start to humanise the victim. So before he's just known as a looter, now we start to think about, or the narrator shows us how he is thinking about this person's role as a human being rather than just a criminal. The grotesque imagery of being able to see broad daylight on the other side highlights the unnecessary violence, and it contributes to this idea of this vivid memory that this narrator has, this speaker has, that he can literally see through this person's body. Then there is some more vague language with the sort of inside out, demonstrates the narrator's inability to process this event, so he almost cannot describe what he saw because it was so unnatural that he uses sort of inside out. The enjambment here between this second stanza and the third stanza demonstrates the fact that this image is consuming, that it almost can't be held in that stanza. It overflows into the next stanza because it's such a visceral, horrifying image, and it takes up more space in his mind, and this is reflected in the structure. The fact that he is then referred to as tossing his guts back into his body and carted off in the back of a lorry makes him seem dehumanized. So the idea of just throwing him into a truck, almost like a cattle, which is the reality of war. Sometimes there isn't the time to be respectful. You just have to get on with your job. So the volta here, which is the change in tone and tense, end of story except not really, definitely gives the reader the impression that there is a long-lasting impact to this. It's not just the isolated incident of the thing that happened that day, but it continues. He talks about his blood shadow on the street, and this is a literal reminder of the death. So he'll see this blood shadow while he's out on his general routine, his checks during the day for weeks on end, and he'll see this literal blood shadow, but it's also a metaphorical blood shadow in his mind. So he cannot get rid of this shadow, and the connotations of the word shadow are darkness and something that follows you forever. Then we've got a slight change in pace where he says, then I'm home on leave. So all of a sudden he changes. He's not thinking about what he needs to think about anymore. He's not in a war zone. He's back at home, which could be or should be a place of safety. But this contrast is quite disorientating because there's no time for him to think, no time for him to plan, no time for him to process. He's just back at home. This could be reflective of soldiers in general and the difficulties they have readjusting to domestic life or civilian life. Enjambment is used again, and in this case it mimics the notion of blinking, but the image is still present. So he says, I blink, and then you would think maybe the image is gone, but because of the enjambment, it shows that the image doesn't disappear once he opens his eyes again. We've got the repeated line of he's probably armed, possibly not, reflecting again the trauma and the guilt. He's not sure whether he should have done what he did. And then in terms of context, the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. Quite a standard way of people managing their post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you've seen the video that this is based on, the soldier talks about the fact that he tried to talk to people about what happened to him and they just laughed him out of the office. They didn't want to know. So his way of coping then was alcohol. And in the final two stanzas, the metaphor of the fact that he describes this looter as being dug in behind enemy lines in his head, this use of military language shows perhaps that the soldier is unable to verbalise his emotions without using military language, but could also show that now his enemy is his memory. So he's not fighting in Iraq anymore, he's fighting his own memory. So this is inner conflict. This part of the poem really slows down the pace. So when you're reading it, this is quite a tricky line because you have to really slow down to say some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. So this gives almost sort of a reflective pause, if you like. The sibilance really slows the pace, which could show a lack of coherent thought. So he's almost gone off now onto a different thought, and he's taking the reader along with him for this. The final couplet, which is recognised because it's written in the same metre, which is unusual because the rest of the poem doesn't have a regular metre, suggests a finality. So the idea that this is what stuck with him now, this is all that is left, this is all he can order in his life, that he is stuck with his bloody life in my bloody hands. The repetition of bloody here could have two meanings. So bloody being the literal blood that he sees, and he feels like he has blood on his hands, which is metaphorical for the guilt he feels. And also the idea that he could be swearing about it because he cannot get over this and he's so upset about it and he just wants to move on, but he can't. And then finally, we've got the personal responsibility here. So even though it started off as a collective and everybody was responsible, he now is personally dealing with this. So it's an individual experience at the end, regardless of what they did as a collective.